I always feel like I get the worst hand clap sounds. I'm always terrified when I have to record hand claps. I'm serious, I never feel I can get it right. I've tried a bunch of things, like, whether it's like a bunch of people around one mic, if it's stereo room mics, if it's one close mic and one ribbon mic farther away. And
welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Today's episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is sponsored by Roswell Pro Audio, maker of handcrafted microphones in California. Inspired design and impeccable attention to detail will help you capture a gorgeous vintage sound without the vintage price tag. Check out their beautiful line of microphones at roswellproaudio.com. Sending your music to be mastered can be scary, but sending your music to a total stranger for mastering can be really scary. Chris Graham is a Billboard chart-breaking mastering engineer with thousands of credits and knows how to make your record sound fantastic. But more importantly, he understands that there is one person that really knows what a great record sounds like, and that's you, rock stars. So if you're thinking about hiring professional mastering, but not sure if it's right for you, go to chrisgrahammastering.com and get a free sample mastering of your song. Go find out just how great your record can sound at chrisgrahammastering.com. Just click the link included in the show notes. Hi, Rockstars. It's your host, Lid Shaw, a.k.a. the Central Studio Scrutinizer. And welcome to the Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Joe Chiccarelli, a 10-time Grammy Award-Winning producer, engineer, and mixer. Joe's credits include such artists as Tori Amos, Beck, The Strokes, The Killers, U2, Elton John, My Morning Jacket, Spoon, The Shins, The White Stripes, Morrissey, Christina Perri, Alanis Morrisette, Jason Mraz, Cafe Tacuba, and the Raconteurs, for which he received his 8th Grammy Award for Best Engineered Album of 2008 for Consolers of the Lonely. And on a side note to that, my stepdaughter, Adia, was actually in the photo on the cover of that album.
yes, you told me. That's pretty amazing. I had no idea. That's crazy.
I know. She's way cooler than I am. Joe has also done music supervision for films such as Suicide Kings and Men with Guns, the TV series Cracker, and Robert Altman's The Gun. He's the designer for the state-of-the-art Royal Tone recording studios and has served as an A&R consultant for several major and independent labels in his career. Joe also got his first big break with one of my favorite artists, Frank Zappa, in 1979, recording Sheik Yerbouti, Joe's Garage Acts I&amp, Shut Up and Play Your Guitar, and Tinsel Town Rebellion. These were all records that I grew up with. In fact, I was such a big fan of Zappa as a kid learning to play guitar that I remember having nightmares about auditioning for Zappa's band and failing because I broke my high E string on my guitar and couldn't get it restrung.
But you actually auditioned, though?
In my dream, I auditioned, yeah.
Okay, amazing.
So, Rockstars, I'm going to put on my proper voice for this. We now take you to a garage studio in East Nashville over Skype to Los Angeles. And please remember that the white zone is for loading and unloading only. If you have to load or unload, please go to the white zone. You'll love it there. It's a way of life. Please welcome Joe Chiccarelli to Recording Studio Rockstars. Joe, are you ready to rock?
I am ready. I am here, Lich.
I hope you didn't mind me slipping into some Joe's Garage there in the intro.
No, pretty funny. Pretty funny. Definitely bring back some memories.
And I apologize. I've lost my voice. So, Rockstars, we actually have both just come back from the AES show in New York. And Joe, I didn't actually run into you on the floor there because it's such a big place. I know you were there. But what an incredible show that was. And what an incredible setup you guys had done there with Mix with the Masters. I couldn't believe it. I mean, there were literally a list of amazing mixers. Every hour for 3 days straight, someone could just sit there and watch you guys teach and speak. How did you enjoy the show?
Show was great. I mean, it's always an opportunity to catch up with friends and see some new gear and geek out for a moment. I don't like to geek out too long, but it was great. And the mix with the masters thing was extraordinary this year. I mean, it was probably 200 people there on the hour. They really did such a great job, and it just shows people's real desire for this knowledge. And I'm really proud to be a part of that. It's such a magical week that goes on in France every year. It's a learning experience for me. It's working with 15, 16 other professionals in a masterclass setting in this beautiful old mill in the south of France. It's just it's paradise there, and you really do get to exchange tips and tricks and working with artists, and you talk about philosophy and strategy. And I don't want to make this sound like an ad for it, but it is a pretty incredible week. Just having come back from it a few weeks ago, it's still fresh, and it's always inspiring. It makes me really look at my process in terms of making records, and I kind of rethink things every time I go there.
Yeah, it's sort of an inspection of the self and the process, I'm sure.
Yes, exactly.
Now, do you know everybody who was there speaking, or were there any new introductions for you as well? At the dinner afterwards, I bumped into Peter Cadis, which was great because he and I worked on a project together a few years ago, but had never met each other. And Tom Elmhurst was there, who had never had a chance to meet before, and he's a wonderful guy. And it was great to hang with Jimmy Douglas and Michael Brower and Al Schmidt and all the gang. So it's always really, really wonderful to be a part of that group. I feel very, very honored to be in that company. Well, yeah. And as I say, it was pretty amazing that you guys were all just there teaching every hour after the hour. And I feel kind of guilty because I was sort of there walking the floor and everything and not taking advantage of all that. So I feel a little lame for not having just sat in one of those chairs for 3 days straight.
Well, that's not the fun part of it. Well, Sitting down for 3 hours in a convention hall is definitely not my idea.
Awesome. Well, it was certainly a great teaching experience or learning experience at AES. I also bumped into Fab DuPont from Pure Mix, who was teaching a big class over another side, and I was able to go see Dave Pensato do his live show from one of the classrooms, and just a cool event. It was the first AES I'd been to.
Oh, wow. Okay. So this was really a very special experience for you. That's great.
It was. That's great. And as you can hear from my voice, I got sick, so I'm still recovering. But there's no way I was going to miss this interview with you and reschedule it as a result of just being, out of the loop or anything. So wonderful to have you here, Joe. I've given an introduction, kind of collected from your own bio and Wikipedia and many places on the internet, but we'd love to hear in your own words some of how you got started in recording.
Well, kind of the same as a lot of other people. I was in a bunch of little bands in Boston where I grew up, and was a bass player, but never really, any of these bands just never amounted to anything. They were kind of cover bands, garage bands, psychedelic bands, all kinds of things, and never really went anywhere, but I was always fascinated with recording, got my first TAC 4-track, and would record my bands and friends, and I found that I was more interested in the recording part of things than I was becoming a great bass player. And I was fortunate in that I had a sort of second cousin who owned a recording studio, and as a teenager, convinced him to let me go hang out there and sweep up floors and box things up and do all that kind of menial task just to hang around the studio. So I got the bug early on, and after going to college, decided to move out to L.A. and got a job at Cherokee Studios as an assistant engineer, and was really, really fortunate in that at 20 years old, I was assisting on a Frank Zappa session.
Wow.
Rest is history.
So I think I had, you and I met once before at the Welcome to 1979 Recording Summit here. And
yes.
I asked you a question thinking that you had been involved in Apostrophe. Was there, did you have anything to do with that one, or was that before you met?
No, that was before my time. The first thing I was involved with was Sheik Yerbouti. That I came in and did overdubs and mixed that album. It was actually tracked live. At the time, Frank felt like his band shined when they were on stage, and he sort of felt like in the studio they were a little stiff and that he couldn't get great performances. So he used to do this thing where he would go and record all the concerts and then bring the tracks into the studio and strip them back. He'd redo keyboards, guitars, vocals, whatever, but keep the rhythm section or keep the main guts of the performance, whatever he felt was real exciting and passionate in terms of the performance, and then would build upon that. So that's how the Sheik Yerbouti album started. Nice. That was my first album with him. And, when you start engineering, you're just happy to be in the studio. You'll work on anything and everything. And I was lucky in that Frank was really a workaholic. And if he was not on the road touring, he wanted to be in the studio. So anytime he got off the road, he'd just call me and say, hey, I want to do another album. So, 3 months later, we were doing the Joe's Garage album. And, after that, it was Tinsel Town Rebellion and Shut Up and Play Your Guitar and so many others. I think I probably did about a half a dozen or so with him. Wow.
Well, I'm sorry I didn't list them all, but what a cool start to recording. You'd already obviously been working. You knew a bit about the studio because this was sort of a first engineering opportunity. Was it, or was it assisting? How was your first involvement?
My first involvement was that Frank booked into Cherokee Studios where I was working as an assistant, and his engineer couldn't make the session, and Frank just said, okay, well, I'll give you a try. And, I had not really been a fan. I didn't know much about his music. I certainly know his name and his reputation. So I don't think I was that overwhelmed or impressed or intimidated by him. I was like, okay, great. This is great. I'll do some vocals and guitar solos with this guy. And we spent, I think, 3 nights together doing just that, and got on just fine, and it was just the two of us working together, and he really was welcoming any kind of feedback from me. And again, like I said, I wasn't intimidated, so I had no problem just telling him the truth about what I thought about a performance or a part or a sound or whatever it was. And I think he really enjoyed my honesty. And after those 3 days, the studio was booked, and he needed to finish the Sheik Yerbouti album, and just said to me, look, I think you did a great job, and we got on fine. Do you want to come with me and finish this album? So I said, give me a few days to think about it, Frank. So of course I did it, and we ended up working all over the place in LA at Sunset Sound, Record Plant, Village Recorder, all over the place. So I got my taste of freelancing immediately,
Yeah.
And it was great. It was I owe Frank an awful lot because I really, at the time, my childhood, my upbringing, my taste in music was pretty much pop music, rock music. I am a jazz fan. I was a jazz fan back then, but pretty much, mainstream pop and rock. And Frank obviously is far from that. His music, what you do. And So it was great for me to work with somebody who was, very unconventional, and his approach to recording was as unconventional as you could get. I think at the time, early 80s, everybody was really trying to make Steely Dan records. Everybody perfect audio, and which is a great thing, but Frank was not about that. He was about really pushing the limits and coming up with things that were new and unique and unusual and caught your ear. So it was great for me to be pushed as an engineer and to know that, I don't have to just do these perfect sort of textbook recordings, that I can do things that have much more character and personality. And I think that was the eye-opening moment for me, because I had always thought recording up to that point was really about perfection in audio, not necessarily character. And so with Frank, it was always an exploration of really kind of finding something new and unique and wacky and unusual, something that just grabbed your ear.
Yeah. Well, I forgot to give a thank you in the intro, so I'll do it now. But I want to thank Ken Sluter, who was also on the show, for introducing you and I and helping to invite you onto Recording Studio Rockstar. So thank you, Ken. Ken had made a comment about you, Joe, where he said he described you as somebody who's not afraid to use any piece of gear or any mic to get the sound. And I feel like that's what you're describing. You don't consider that there are only the right tools to use. You'll just use whatever you think will get the right character for a sound.
Yeah, I think it's about really kind of getting what's in your head, or more importantly, what's in the artist's head out through the speakers. And, like everybody, I have my favorite pieces of gear, but in the end, it's not about that. To me, it's about whatever brings forth the artist's vision. And if that's, some really crappy lo-fi mic, or if that's some, $10,000 microphone and the latest piece of hardware, fine. But it's really about really connecting with the artist and helping him put forth his vision. So I think as it's been said many times, the only rule is there are no rules.
Yeah. Did you ever have a chance to work with Don Von Vliet, Captain Beefheart?
I did not have a chance to work with Don, although I am a fan of his music, a fan of his painting. In fact, Jack White and I bonded over Don's painting. Jack owns one of his pieces, or a couple of pieces maybe, and we're big fans of him. And it's funny because I was talking about this the other day, that Bat Chain Puller and everything on that first album, it still to this day sounds so futuristic. It doesn't sound like it was made in any time. It's like Monk or something. It just feels like, where did this come from? When was it created? I don't know. It doesn't matter. It's very, very classic music. I mean, I think he really talk about pushing the limits. I mean, he really created something that no one else can match.
Have you seen that tendency in some artists versus others? Some artists just have an ability or a knack to create timeless things. I mean, you've made a lot of records with a lot of people.
Yeah, I think there, talent comes in all forms, and there are definitely those artists that are risk takers and braver than other artists. Beck and U2 come to mind. They really are about kind of exploring and pushing themselves and not being satisfied repeating themselves ever. And to me, that's I think artists need to grow and develop over their career, and they get to try to go through different phases and try different things. Sometimes they fail, sometimes they succeed. but I think it's your job as a record maker to help an artist grow and take chances and not repeat themselves and really come up with new sounds and new approaches to their music. So yeah, it's great, and it's amazing when you work with artists that really take chances like that, because it becomes a drug, and it also becomes a standard, a bar which you measure all other artists. And it can be sometimes a little disappointing if I'm working with an artist who I find doesn't push themselves and is happy copying what's on the radio at the moment. Usually that's a big warning sign for me. That's usually when I run away. I just think that I hope we're all here to do something extraordinary and unusual. And I just know that when I was a kid getting into music, the things that inspired me, whether it was Miles Davis or Led Zeppelin, were artists that created their own world, that created this thing when you put the CD in, you just were transported to another place, and you didn't want to leave there. You wanted to find out everything about that artist and the way they thought and their creative process. And that's to me, that's the magic of this. So I really try to push artists to do that and to sort of dig deep with them and come up with things that are really new and fresh, and do things that they may consider a little unsafe or out of the ordinary for them. And it's tricky being a producer, because you do want artists to grow and you do want to push them. It's just finding that balance to where they're comfortable, they feel safe in the studio, they feel like they can make a good record, but they also feel like, wow, we're doing something new here. I've never done a record that sounds like this.
Is there part of your beginning process in a production that allows that to happen, allows you guys to build that dialogue and sort of begin to understand this whole thing you're about to do?
Absolutely. With any artist I work with, big or small, I usually spend a fair amount of time meeting with them, talking about what they want to do, how they feel about their past albums, where they want to go with this album, what their process is like. And then from there, I get into listening to all their demos and making some comments on the demos, whether, it's the only comment is no comment, this sounds amazing, or like, hey, I'm not sure this chorus melody is strong enough, or did you think of writing another section for this tune? So I get into all that, but I really get into what the artist wants to achieve with the record. And if I feel like I'm in sync with that I understand that, and I can help them deliver that, then that's when I decide to take the project on. I mean, there have been times when artists have had a particular vision about what they want to do, and I don't really see them in that light. I feel like creatively that might be a mistake for them, or it might be repeating themselves, or it might be the wrong time for them to do something so radical, So to do something perhaps that their fan base won't understand. Maybe they need to grow their fan base first before they go and venture out on something that's outside their genre. So I really take all that into consideration before I take the project on. And then once I do, the dialogue continues. Then we get into pre-production, and especially if it's a band, I'm taking usually a week to 3 weeks in pre-production, working out song arrangements, keys, tempos, sometimes even sort of helping the band achieve sounds, having working with the guitar player, coming up with new guitar sounds for them. Those sort of things get accomplished in pre-production. But
like instrument discovery.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of like, you're building this beast from the ground up, and that's step one, is working on the songs and the arrangements and the structures way before I get into the studio. I mean, sometimes there have been records that I have done without that pre-production. It's always a little awkward, but it works out. My Morning Jacket is one thing that comes to mind. The guys had spent a lot of time on their own in a cabin in Colorado writing songs and doing their own pre-production, rehearsing a lot before I got involved. And when I approached them about spending time to do pre-production, they were sort of like, we just camped out for a month in a cabin up in the woods. We're not sure we want to go into a rehearsal room and do that all again. And I respected that, but I just said, look, I hope that when we get in the studio, and if I have input, that you guys are going to be open to that. And of course they said yes, but it was a little tricky at first. I had to sort of prove myself. We went through the first couple of days of me making suggestions, and people being very respectful. They're the greatest bunch of guys in the world, and they just have an amazing democracy as a band. Really, they're just gentlemen and professionals. I can't say enough great things about them. But I had to kind of prove myself, and once I did, then it was a really happy team, and we went on and made I think a very good record. At the time, I think that some of their fans saw it as a departure, as them trying a lot of different things, a lot of different genres. And in fact, it's funny. There was some review on the record that said that producer Joe Chiccarelli pushed them to do these R&B grooves. And the funny thing is that, if you heard the demos before, all those R&B grooves were there. And the funny part of it is that we were talking about where to make the record. In the past, the band had gone off to remote locations to record, and we were looking at different places, and I said to them, look, these songs have got a lot of groove. They got a lot of life. They're not the sort of dreamy, moody, pastoral pieces that you've written in the past. This sounds like an urban record to me. You should be in an environment that's alive and inspirational, and you should also be in a place where you have access to other musical instruments and other players. If you want to call a horn section in, or a string section in, or if you want to go rent a set of vibes or whatever it might be, that it's easy to do. If you're out in the cornfields, it's not going to be easy to do that, and you may limit yourself in what you can do with the record if you don't have access to those other possibilities. So the band, thought that really made sense to them, and we looked at doing it in cities and couldn't quite find the right situation. And I finally said, you know what, let's just go to New York. It'll be great for everybody. Those guys, for the most part, had all grown up in Lexington, Kentucky, and New York was a bit of an adventure for them. And it turned out to be great, because we all, would sometimes go out for a drink after the sessions or walk to the studio together in the morning. And it was really a great little family. And we had a great time doing it.
New York has just such an energy to it. Having just come back. I mean, of course, I got a little bit sick, but that's, it's just, there isn't an energy to being in a big city like that. And that's cool. I haven't heard anybody else describe, the groove of a record, saying like, well, it needs to be in an urban environment to actually record it. That's cool to hear that.
Yeah, I just thought it would be inspirational for them, and I think it was. I think they pushed themselves. I think they did things that they normally wouldn't do, and and we did in the end bring in a string section, and it was a great experience. We actually ended up going to Nashville for a few weeks at the end to do some vocals and background vocals and touch up, but for the most part, it was made in the city.
Do you spend a lot of time working at Blackbird Studios when you're in Nashville? Is that a place you like to work?
Blackbird is my home away from home. I am based here at Sunset Sound and in Hollywood, which is a great old studio. I use Studio One all the time, which is a classic room. A lot of Stones records are done there. The Doors, Janis Joplin, Beck, Van Halen, so many classic records. And I love the room. And I have a private overdub room here too as well, and it's really my home. But to go to Nashville and work at Blackbird is always so exciting. I mean, the rooms sound so great. Obviously, they have every piece of gear you could ever imagine. Yeah. The assistants are so professional. The staff there is so kind, and the whole experience is just such a pleasant experience that I feel excited, to go there all the time. I'm I grew up on the East Coast. I'm a blue state kind of guy. So to go to Nashville, to go to the South is a little bit of a challenge, but I will take that on anytime to go to Blackbird.
Well, we're a blue dot floating in an ocean of red over here. So.
Yes. I know you are.
You should feel at home as long as you don't venture out.
It's true. Very true.
Well, I've had Mark Rubel on the show, and he's such a fantastic guy. And then
Sweetheart.
I've been exchanging emails with John McBride, so I look forward to having him on the show as well. You were talking about sometimes a band has too big of a vision for what might be appropriate now, and it reminded me of a quote from Henry Miller, the author, where he talked about early authors. They think their first book they write is going to be the greatest book they ever write, and it always just turns out to be shit. and I wondered if you feel like, I guess you kind of talked about that, but if there's anything else you want to say about bands when they're making their first record, sometimes making it too complicated, and what does it mean to make a first record? First records are tricky, but they're also exciting because it's the band's first time really doing this, perhaps with a major record label contract. So everybody feels like they're on top of the world. So there's a lot of positivity there. But at the same time, often bands haven't figured themselves out yet. They don't really know who they are, or perhaps they don't know their strengths and their weaknesses, and there's a lot of self-discovery that needs to happen. Sometimes bands are fully realized by that point. They've been together for a while, but oftentimes it happens that, they've been together a year or two and they have their first record deal. They've been stockpiling these songs for 5 years or whatever it might be. And they come to the first album with songs that are a bit disconnected. They're done over periods of growth, and obviously when you're young, your growth spurts are huge. So 1 minute you might be in this kind of raw punk stage, and the next minute you want to make lush layered records. And when you're producing a band that has all these influences and all these phases that they've gone through to get to their first album, it's a little tricky because you have to say, guys, now we have to make something that's cohesive. It's a statement as to who you are. It needs to represent you and your strong points. And yes, I know you're really fond of that song, but it doesn't quite feel like it fits in here. Or what often happens is the band gets signed to a label because of some song that they wrote 5 years ago, and the band is moved on. They don't like it anymore. They don't want to play it. They don't care about it. But the label is going, that's the single. That's the one. That's the one. And is the label right?
Sometimes, yes. And, I can tell you, like, for instance, with the Young the Giant album I did a few years ago, the label believed in this song, Cough Syrup. That's all they cared about. And it was a tune that the band had for a while. And everything with the label was about making Cough Syrup as great as it could be, making sure it hit all the marks that the demo hit. And when we played the album for the label and came across the song My Body, which turned out to be the first single, everybody at the label was like, yeah, that's a good one. We like that. We like that. And the band was sort of like, wait a minute, this is the one. You guys are really that into Cop Syrup, and you don't hear My Body? And the label felt like, yeah, we like that one. But it wasn't until I think the label played it around the office, played it for radio promo people, that everybody went, no, wait a minute. Cop Syrup's really good. Let's not put it out first. Let's put out My Body, see what happens. And the album blew up, and 600,000 sales later,
So there was a YouTube link that you sent me before this interview, which is an interview with you and Fab DuPont, talking about mixing with UA plugins. And I think you used a Young the Giant track in that sample. So Rockstars, I'll include that link in the show notes too, so you can get, I'm going to have a lot of links in the show notes for this one, because you have so many great records, Joe. I got a lot of things to put in there. Well, so let's see. What else do I want to ask you? You had talked about working with Morrissey, and I wondered if you wanted to share any stories about that, because I know you had a cool experience.
Yeah, I've done 2.5 albums now, I guess, with Morrissey, and he's wonderful. I mean, he's just a very unique artist. I think he's one of the great ones. I was a fan before I came into it, working with him, so it was really an exciting opportunity for me. In fact, talk about segues here. The way I got involved with him was by working on some B-sides for the Swords album, and then he later heard the Young the Giant album and just flipped out. He thought that album was so great, to the point where he sat his band down and made them listen to the album and said, when we make our next album, it has to be as good as this, because this band is just fantastic. Wow. And this album is fantastic. So thankfully, the band said to Mraz, the guy that we worked on those B-sides with is the guy that produced this album, so maybe you should talk to him. And he and I sat down and chatted and got on fine. And I'm a vegetarian, so I think that won me a couple of points. And it was a good start. And we went off then and did the World Peace album, which was 4 years ago. And that turned out great. We went to La Fabrique Studios in France, where they do the Mix with the Masters classes, and he absolutely loved the experience of it there. He loved the studio and the sounds, and just, it's a very creative environment. And the whole thing was just a great experience for him, and he was an absolute pleasure to work with. I mean, actually, in some ways, the ideal artist for a producer, because he's the kind of guy that will, he's a storyteller. His stuff is very cinematic, very theatrical, very visual. So he'll sit down and tell you what the story's about or what he's feeling for a particular track. He won't talk in terms of, notes or chords or guitar sounds or EQs or any of that sort of stuff. He'll talk really broad about how he wants the song to feel. Yeah. And then he'll leave it up to the band and myself to come up with something that portrays that vision. And then he'll come back and listen to it, and he'll say, I think this is great, but I feel like this section is weak. This should be bigger here. This is the climax of the tune. This needs to be more powerful here. Or, he might have a comment on the groove, or, want to hear some little specific sound effects. He loves his sound effects. And, it really is like making a musical theater. I've talked to a number of people about it, and everything needs to be very visual with him. And it's not quite like making a pop or rock record in the way that I'm accustomed to. And I don't necessarily have to try to achieve the sort of things that I would achieve by getting a song on the radio. It's more about achieving his vision for the song and having the right character for that particular song.
Now, with all due respect, I noticed that you did sneak in some pretty powerful drums on that record, though.
Well, that's not me. That's Matt Walker, who's been Mraz's drummer for easily 10 years, is a fantastic drummer. He's really one of the best.
That's great.
He's a good drummer, but on top of it, he's a deep thinker. He really sort of looks at a tune and thinks about how he wants to craft a drum part, what he wants it to say, what the sound should be. And with this particular album, this new album, not the World Peace album, he was really fantastic to work with, in that often the two of us would spend extra hours late at night, try to come up with some different things on songs. And he kind of goes the distance. In fact, the whole band is really like that. It's Mraz's family, and they really care about him, and they want the best for him. And it really is kind of like, what rock bands used to be, or what you think they should be.
It's fun when you can have a band like that. If your own band is ever like that and doesn't break up somewhere along the way.
Exactly.
That's pretty cool.
Exactly.
So a couple of things. When you're in Nashville, if you don't already know about them next time, Wild Cow and then the Indian restaurant Woodlands. Those are two of the best vegetarian restaurants I know of in Nashville. So you need to check those out.
I will. Wild Cow is the one that's over on East Side, right?
Yep, East Nashville,
yeah. Been there. It's very good. It's great.
And I think Woodlands is under construction, so hopefully they'll come back. But so were you a Morrissey fan sort of prior to all this too? I mean, and I have to say, when I think of Morrissey, as a younger me listening to it, I think of about 3 vocal notes, which I'm probably not alone. And I wonder, how did that play into making the new record? And was that is his vocal style very different now than it was then? Was that something you guys even discussed? Is that a dumb question?
No. Well, personally, I actually think his range is a bit bigger than that, a lot bigger than that. I actually sometimes find that his melodies are very big and sweeping and almost European in a way. They sort of remind me of a lot of Latin pop or Italian pop. They're very dramatic, I guess, is what I'm thinking of. I guess when you think of Smith's stuff, perhaps the vocal range was a bit more limited, but I think over the years, he's quite an interesting character in that, you can talk to him all day long about the Ramones or the New York Dolls, but at the same time, you can talk to him about Jack Jones and Al Martino and Frank Sinatra. Nice. I mean, he knows a lot about all kinds of music, but there's a side of him that really understands those classic 40s, 50s crooners singers, and his style sort of reminds me of that at times. It's quite fascinating.
All right, so let's there's one question I want to ask that is something that you brought up yourself, and then there's a lot of questions I want to ask that are kind of about recording. But let me start with a question about Morrissey. What's a great vocal mic for Morrissey when you record him? How do you record his vocals?
Well, I wanted to go for something really big and classic. And when we first started working, we tried a bunch of things from 67s and blue bottle microphones. And for the most part, we ended up with a classic Neumann U47. Sometimes we used a newer Telefunken U47 because it was a little brighter, a little clearer. The new mics tend to be a little bit more open. The old ones maybe a little grittier. So often we'd go back and forth between a little dirtier sounding old 47 and a little bit more hi-fi.
Sort of song to song.
Yeah, we'd change up. It was rare that we'd vary out beyond those kind of microphones. Occasionally, I do some processing with plugins. I'm a big fan of like the Isotope vocal synth, and we use that, or it might be a decapitator to distort a particular section. But he really is a classic singer. And what's interesting, and I told this story at AES, is that he tends to sing about 1.5 feet, 2 feet away from the mic, just like when you see those shots of Sinatra in the studio.
Right.
He's not on top of the windscreen. He's back a foot or so. And when you get Morrissey and you put him on top of the mic, it doesn't sound like Morrissey anymore. It's very interesting. He definitely, that's part of his sound. He has a big voice, and it's kind of bold and mid-rangey, and it can take the distance.
What about, things that people need to think about as far as using a compressor when recording a voice like Morrissey's, or how to set a compressor as a starting place?
With a singer like that, he's very capable of doing something on the first take that's top to bottom keepers. So I'm very careful about what I do. And now, having worked with him a few times, I know that most vocals are going to happen in 2-3 takes maximum. And so I know that I got to get my sound really quickly. I got to kind of know where the preamp needs to be and whatever I'm doing EQ-wise. So basically all that'll happen in a verse and chorus rundown. So I've got about 30 seconds to get a sound, basically.
Nice.
And so I tend to be gentler with the compression. We kind of went back and forth between, LA2A compressors and TubeTech CL1Bs, just depending on what we were looking for. And again, a good opto is a safe place to be with a vocal if you're not really sure how much to compress something. And, with him, I would say it's a couple of dB. Every once in a while it might hit 5 or 7, but it's, a dB here, 2 dB there. Yeah. But he's very good at working the mic, and this album was interesting in that the way we go about it is we sort of do guide vocals with the band, and sort of as a pointer where the direction of the song needs to be, and then we rebuild the track around those guide vocals. And with the World Peace album, I would say most of the final vocals ended up being those guide vocals. But with this particular record, Mraz really wanted to try to top himself. And we went back in and redid, maybe 60% of the vocals. But my point is that, you've got to be really quick. You got to understand the voice. You got to know that something could happen in the first take or so, and you better be ready. Years ago, I was really lucky in that I did a half dozen albums with Etta James, the great blues R&B singer, and Etta could come in at 10 o'clock in the morning and knock off 3 or 4 songs, one, maybe 2 take, and that's it. It's done. So, I had to really get sounds fast, get sounds that were good, but also transparent, that didn't ruin the character of her voice, that really preserved it and enhanced it. But, I had to be careful. So, after time, it's funny, you develop this sort of understanding of a voice, and where it's peaky, where it's lacking, and you start to have this knowledge of microphones, and you realize, oh, well, this guy's got a darker voice, but there's some nuance on the top of his voice that's really, really interesting. There's a kind of crackly breakup that's got a lot of heart and personality. And I have to find a microphone that brings that out. So I need something that's brighter, but perhaps has a lot of air on top that will help enhance those little bits for him. So you start to pair things up. It's almost like being a chef and knowing what dessert might be too sweet after a meal. You have to find this great combination. So I definitely spend a lot of time doing that. And even that, to me, starts way back when I listen to the artist's demos or their last album, or if I'm in pre-production with the band, I'm kind of checking out the singer, thinking, okay, in this range, he sounds a little shrill. Do I need to bring the key down here? Or is it that I just have to find the right microphone when he's in his upper range? And all those sort of things that you're, to me, the best quote that I ever heard was Steve Lillywhite said to an engineer friend of mine, "We're always mixing." And I think that's just sums it up for me, that I am always looking for the end result before I ever get in the studio. Like from the day I listen to those demos, I'm thinking about what the final mix is going to sound like, what the arrangement of the tune is going to be. I'm kind of looking to the finished picture. It's like a director of a movie. He's got it all in his head where he wants each scene to go and how it all adds up together. And I think you got to approach it, at least for me, I found that that's the best approach for me, is that if I kind of work towards that end every single step of the way.
That's so cool. And listening to your records, I hear so many details in the sounds of these records that are clear to me that you knew that this was the right sound for that part in this place in the mix. And it's a little daunting to think of being able to do what you just described being able to do. And I think that maybe a message for me and all of our listeners is it's okay. It takes a lot of time. You probably had to try a lot of mics in your life and a lot of situations to have this kind of vocabulary that you've got now.
Oh, I mean, I make mistakes every day. Like the whole process is a big puzzle. Every day is a learning experience. And I told the folks the story of the White Stripes, that when Jack called me about doing that album, I was really, really excited, and I thought a lot about it, and I kind of went, wow, this might be the opportunity for me to make my kind of classic Glyn John sort of real rock album that is just two people in a room, not many microphones, really classic microphones, recorded like appropriately, a 67, a foot or two from the guitar amp, 3 microphones on the drums. And I really thought about it. And when I went in to start the album, that's the way I approached it.
And this is Icky Thump, right?
This is the Icky Thump album. But the interesting thing is that about 20 minutes, a half hour into getting drum sounds with my, minimal setup. And, I kind of thought that, wow, 2 instruments, I have all this space in the mix to showcase instruments in a natural way. I started getting sounds, and I realized that, oh my God, this is really boring. This is small sounding. This is never going to stand up against a hip hop record in 2008 or whatever year that was. And I gotta do something else. So I instantly took an about face, and I said, hey, Jack, I need 20 minutes, and I want to rethink this. And I said to the assistant, bring me 20 more microphones, 10 more compressors, and 15 more EQs and everything else you can find in the building.
You're a Blackbird, right?
Exactly. So that's just a walk to the closet,
Right.
And I took a whole other approach to the record because I realized that my vision for it, if you will, was I don't want to say wrong, but was inappropriate, or there could be something more, that I perhaps maybe even selfishly looked at it as an opportunity for a particular creative exercise that maybe wasn't the best for the band, for the music. And I just said to Jack, I want to do something that's bigger, that's more powerful, that's more hard-hitting, that's more modern. And Jack is just like, he's such a pro. He's such a sweetheart. I can't say enough great things about him. Talk about learning experience. And he just said, yeah, whatever, just do your thing. And, I just kind of powered everything up, toughened everything up, made it more aggressive, more modern, more in your face, more full frequency. It's interesting. It actually takes a lot of sound to fill up two speakers and make it competitive. When you think about modern pop records and how big they are and how processed they are, in a way, I wanted to make something that was competing with that, but sort of at least equal in terms of its impact. So, I instantly started pulling out the compressors and the subharmonic synthesizer and, the distortion boxes and everything else. And it became this thing of like, how intense, how big, how in your face can we make this record?
So now I want to keep pushing you on this question a little bit. You talked about bringing, well, first of all, do you remember who your assistant was on that record?
Yeah, Lowell Reynolds.
All right. I thought it'd be worth giving him a shout out for that.
Lowell's great. Lowell saved my butt so many times with Raconteurs and My Morning Jacket and Manchester Orchestra. And he was with me for so many projects. He's gone on to engineer tons of records for Jakir, King, and a lot of other producers now. He's a really, really great guy, a great engineer.
Oh, that's great. You described him as bringing you a whole pile of mics, a whole pile of compressors. So now we want to know, how do you, Joe, handle going through those? For example, some of us might have been inclined to go, ooh, that one sounds cool. Let's put that on a track. Ooh, that one sounds cool. Let's put that one on a track. Next thing you know, we've got like 20 tracks of all these different chains of drums. And when you listen to it, it just sounds horrible. How do you manage that? Do you have any advice for kind of sorting through that with so many options and actually selecting what you felt like was the best combination in the end?
Wow, it's a good question. I just kind of thought about how, in this case, how I could make two people sound as big and impressive as possible. For instance, in the case of the guitars, it was for the most part a 57 and a Coles 4038 on each guitar amp. Sometimes it was an Audio Engineering Associates R84 instead of the Coles. And usually I had a room mic as well, like a 67, maybe placed 5 or 6 feet back from the amp to get a little bit of the sound of the booth that the amp was in. Luckily, they were in a big sort of piano-sized booth. And but it was really in that case about bigness and impact and what one microphone lacked, I would get from the other microphone. Mm-hmm. So in other words, 57 has the middle and the ribbon has the low end, and I put together a bigger sound, and then blend in a little bit of the room mic to get a little 3D in the picture. Mm-hmm. And that's the guitar. And, luckily that room, Studio D at Blackbird, is fantastic sounding. There's a kind of live chamber that's sort of in the room, adjacent to the room, that sounds wonderful. And you can kind of crack the door open at times and get a little bit of this reverb into the drum sound. And we did that on a couple of tunes.
And is D the one with the ceiling that elevators up and down for the chamber length?
That's A.
Oh, that's
A.
Okay.
Yeah, D has a similar chamber, but it's not movable walls or anything.
Okay, all Well, wonderful. Now, what about with the drums? How might you kind of arrive at which combination of things you wanted? So you started with a very minimal drum miking. Did you end up with a lot more drum mics than you expected, or was it more about treatments of those mics?
It was both. I definitely went from 4 mics to 14 mics, and it was putting. Meg had a double-sided, double-skinned bass drum, so I actually mounted a microphone inside the drum as well as 47 FET outside the drum, and I probably used a sub kick on some tunes. There were multiple room mics. I used on that album. I used a AEA R88, the stereo ribbon mic, and I had it behind the drums. I use that mic a lot, and usually it's in front of the drums. But at the time, in that particular room with Meg, I liked the way it sounded, sort of over her shoulder. Mm-hmm. And then there were 87s in the room, and so I'll often use a lot of really junky lo-fi mics that I'll even just throw them on the floor somewhere and just compress the hell out of them or distort them, and I don't get too fussy with them. They're more like a piece of the puzzle, They're just I find like drum sounds and even putting together a mix is all about how the pieces add up. So it doesn't really matter what that one mic sounds like. It's what it's bringing to the equation. Sometimes it's air, sometimes it's crack, sometimes it's distortion. It's just a piece.
Mm-hmm. And so, you described Steve Lillywhite as saying we're always mixing, and would you have recorded some of these sounds for the drums that were, 5 of them were muted while you were working? Or is it more like, let's select everything that we really think we want to hear right now, and if we don't want to hear it right now, we don't even need it?
Yeah, if there were 6 room mics and I determined that the one mono room mic in the middle was the right sound, that's the only thing that got recorded. If I liked all 6 mics, they all got blended down to 1 or 2 tracks. In the case of the White Stripes and the Raconteurs, those were done on 16-track analog tape. So you really had to make your choices, get a sound, and call it a day. There was no printing 40 tracks of drums and deciding which thing to use later. There was no putting samples in the drums. It's all analog. Right. So that had to be the sound there. And, that is one thing I definitely feel I've been lucky in, that I came up in the days of 24-track analog tape, where you really did have to get your sound right there on the session, and producers expected it to sound like a record. If it didn't sound like a final mix while you're there tracking, producers were upset and you wouldn't get the gig the next time. So I kind of learned about really getting a sound and committing to it and thinking about the end result. So I'm not shy about making all those choices and just committing to it. And you know what? If you make a mistake, there's ways out.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought up tape. I had heard a story. I know that you are that it's very important to you to keep the session flowing, right? You talked about that with Morrissey's vocals and everything. You don't want to slow it down 30 seconds to get your vocal sound, because you want to be capturing. And I think I had heard a story about you making sure that the tape reels were rewound or forward wound. Let's see, they're tails out normally, so they would have been heads out, so that there was no loss of time if you had to put a new tape reel on. Is that still sort of a practice that you do? And do you want to talk about the importance of why it's worth putting an extra effort into keeping your session flowing at all times?
I think that's, it's all about vibe. It's all about getting a flow, keeping people engaged. And, sometimes with analog tape, that time that it took to rewind, people could be out of the mood. So I would always insist that, there were reels that were heads out and ready to go if we were in the middle of a take, and you wouldn't waste 5 minutes rewinding and blow the vibe. That's nice. I think that's a lot of it. It's just really is capturing a moment, and those moments, they're fleeting. You just got to get it when you're on a roll, when everything feels good. You don't stop. I mean, and mixing. When you're mixing on a console, even with automation, it's the same thing where all of a sudden everything just locks together, and it feels like, oh, there it is. There's the record. It's all glued together. It's done. And you got to know that's the point where you hit print,
Yeah.
And when you work in the box, it's a very different experience. I find that I'm not ever finding that magical moment. I'm always going through this checklist of, okay, I got this right. I got that right. I fixed the guitar solo. I fixed the vocals that were low. I guess I fixed all the little problems. Yeah, I guess we're done. And you don't. I find that there aren't those magical moments as well.
Well, how do we bring that moment back? So since so many of us are working in the box these days.
Well, I think the key to me is not overthinking it, not overdoing it. I think it's, trying to, I personally feel faders are really, really important, having faders and not mixing with a mouse. I think maybe, if you're younger and you grew up doing nothing but mixing on a mouse, you might be good at it. But I find having some fader control service is really, really important. But Ken Sluter and I went through this because Ken mixes a lot for me. Mm-hmm. And there was one particular tune that I remember telling him, I think this one just needs some fader dynamics. And, he kind of started to do that with the mouse and did it as best as possible. And he kind of went, I'm going to go out and buy a fader pack. And he said, after that day, all his mixes just got like 40% better by the fact that he wasn't afraid to just sit there and grab a fader and turn it up, as opposed to thinking like, oh, okay, that guitar solo needs to come up 2.8 dB. Let me bring that up.
Any particular fader packs working with Pro Tools that you've recently begun to enjoy a lot?
The Avid one is great. The Artist Control, whatever they call it. Mm-hmm. I have a C24 DigiDesign interface here, which works fine for me. But there's so many of them now, even down to the PreSonus one faders and all that kind of thing. Yeah. Well, but I think that's kind of important. Even writing vocals, I think you can put so much expression in a vocal by kind of feeling the dynamics of it out, as opposed to kind of looking at a graph.
Yeah. Well, I think that when you physically grab a fader, you actually have less control in a way. It's more, you're just making a movement, and you're not getting caught up in all these digits and numbers and thinking you can, infinitesimally control everything. And maybe it opens up room for a little bit more error where you really get expression, which is cool.
That's really great. I think that's very, very true. I think that is the case, that you definitely sometimes overshoot the mark, or you bring the tail end of a word up 5 dB and not even know it, because you just kind of push the fader because it felt right. And if you were to grab the last syllable of a word in Pro Tools and crank it up 5 dB, you might start to go, God, that looks really weird. What's wrong here?
Right.
So.
All right, wonderful. So I got more questions for you, but let's take a break here, and we'll come back in for more questions in the jam session. Rockstars, our guest today is Joe Chiccarelli. Joe, thank you for being here with us. You can find links to all the stuff we're talking about in the show notes on your mobile device. Just look at your podcasting app. They should be right there. Click through and check it out. We'll see you guys in just a moment for the jam session. Roswell Pro Audio brings you microphone design that is out of this world. Endorsed by a growing list of artists and producers like Phil Collen of Def Leppard, Ross Hogarth, who's recorded Van Halen, Ziggy Marley, and the Doobie Brothers, and Supa Dupes, working with Drake, Mary J. Blige, and Eminem. These are all rock stars that have discovered just how great Roswell microphones sound. Check out the Mini K47, which uses a capsule modeled on the one in the vintage U47, at a street price of only $299. Or the beautiful Delphos condenser microphone with a capsule tuned like the vintage U67 with great clarity and far lower noise at a street price of only $899. In fact, you are hearing my voice right now on the beautiful Delphos microphone. These mics are carefully crafted by hand and immediately feel good even before you plug them in and hear how great they sound. These are well-built microphones that will last you and your studio a lifetime of great recording. Check out more audio examples of these awesome mics at roswellproaudio.com. Are you having trouble getting your mixes to sound professional? Are you mixing and mastering yourself? Did you know that the vast majority of the world's best mix engineers almost never master their own mixes? So if you're thinking about hiring a professional mastering engineer, check out Chris Graham Mastering. Chris is a Billboard chart-breaking mastering engineer who has mastered thousands of songs for both professional and home studio clients just like you. Send one of your songs to Chris and he'll master a sample of your song for free. If you decide to hire him, you can also get a free video mix consultation before mastering to help you get the most out of your mix. To learn more, check out chrisgrahammastering.com or just click the link in the show notes. Rockstars, we're back now for more questions with Joe Chiccarelli on Recording Studio Rockstars, and we're going to jump into the jam session too. Joe, it's wonderful to have you here on the show. You were talking about working with tape. You were talking about mixing on a console. I made a note to ask you one of the things, since we're all working in the box so often these days, what do you want to say about file format working, recording, and getting a high resolution recording? Because as I listened through your discography, I kept thinking your records always sound hi-fi, no matter what era of Pro Tools or tape we might have been in. And so I admire your ability to make sure that the sound quality of a record is always where you want it to be. That was a long way to ask the question. How do you like to set your file format in Pro Tools?
Okay. I've recorded 2496 or 3296 for as long as I can remember. I think around 2000 or 2001, I did an album with jazz trumpeter Chris Bodie, and he wanted to do it on tape, but he said, I'll do it in Pro Tools as long as we record it 96K. And I was like, sure, of course, why not? And we went and did it, and I instantly was like, wow, what have I been missing here working at 48 all these last few years? And ever since that moment, I have never done anything below 96K. And ever since 32-bit came out, I'm finding that's even a little bit more open, and plugins seem to work well in 32-bit. And so all my sessions now tend to be 32-bit 96K. I would do 192, but often, with sessions, tracks can run 100 plus, and it gets crazy.
Yeah. We don't have to get too technical about it, but 32, I understand, also allows the DAW to act differently with its processing internally, right?
Yes, from what I know.
Yeah, so it actually supposedly makes the plugins function better and not sort of hit a ceiling or something.
Correct.
Like that. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So let's rewind for a sec and go back to Frank Zappa for one moment. There was a song on Joe's Garage where the girls they're doing their foot stomps and hand claps.
Right.
I have noticed that sometimes it's hard to get a good foot stomp and hand clap recording. You want to drop any hints for us for some good ways to get great foot stops and hand claps that we'll like when we're done with the recording of it?
It's funny you say that because I always feel like I get the worst hand clap sounds. I'm always terrified when I have to record hand claps. I'm serious. I never feel I can get it right. I've tried a bunch of things like, whether it's like a bunch of people around one mic, if it's stereo room mics, if it's one close mic and one ribbon mic farther away, and compression, no compression. I go back and forth all the time on it. It's tricky. Sometimes I find you just get lucky with it. I did a track with Vance Joy, and the whole tune is really claps and stomps and layers of percussion, and it's just always tricky. And it's sort of about adding up layers. I've found is the best thing. In other words, I might do one track that's close and kind of dry, and then I'll do another track of claps or stomps that's heavily compressed, and then I'll do one that's maybe somebody kicking a road case, and I'll just blend a bunch of tracks together until I get the right thing I'm looking for. But it's funny, and it's often that you want to make them as exciting as possible, but when you start to make that stuff overly processed, it sounds harsh and brittle and unnatural. Right. So it's always like this compromise. Well, how do I get it to sound like a natural hand clap, but still have that spank and that life? I definitely go back and forth with it.
It's so unfair because when it comes time for stomps and hand claps, everybody looks at you like this must be the easiest overdub we could ever be asked to do.
Seriously, I am terrified when people go, let's do some hand claps. I go, oh no, I don't know if I hope I'll get it today. Maybe I just get the balance between the room and the close mic right. And honestly, it's a really funny thing to record.
Can't you just be the producer that travels with his own hand claps and you just sort of import them into every record?
I actually do that.
All right, there you go. Great answer. The Strokes Angles record has a really wonderful sound. It's one of the things I really love about the Strokes is everything is so tight, all the instruments, and it's like right up in your face, and it's sort of this rhythmic experience and melodic experience of everything just kind of winding in and out of each other, and there's a wonderful deep snare on that. And now I know it's unfair to ask you extreme specifics about each record you've done in nearly 50 years, but maybe you can comment on great ways to get a deep snare sound that's like, that kind of thing. I hope that sounded good over podcast.
I actually had a lot of bottom. It sounded very good. It's down to the drum. It's really tuning. It's getting a drum that's just fat and gushy and having a fair amount of dampening on it. Oftentimes I'll put like a yellow pad, a few pieces of 8.5 by 11 paper on the snare. That tends to be just weight it down enough. But it's always tuning. In the case of the Strokes, those guys are just brilliant and unique arrangers of their material. Like the way that all those pieces work together, the way that their parts work together is phenomenal. They're all just such great musicians, and it was a challenging record to make just because of the point in the band's career that they were at the time. But I can't say enough about them as people and players. They were just really, really, really a pleasure to work with, and they really have an understanding of what makes their sound. And in fact, we did that at Avatar Studios in New York, and we had multiple drum kits set up, 2 and 3 kits set up in different locations for different types of sounds. But often we would build drum kits one instrument at a time, just do the kick drum, just do the snare drum.
Really, in the recording process?
Yeah, because they really like those nice, tight, punchy sounds. And as beautiful sounding as a room as Avatar is, it's ambient. And sometimes that's not the right thing. thing. So it was really about getting every element of the sound right. Sometimes I'd just put a mic on a hi-hat and put the hi-hat through a guitar amp and get it really trashy and mid-rangey, and that would be the start of the track. And then we'd put the kick drum on, then we'd put the snare drum on.
Well, it's interesting because that quality of that should be similar to a drum machine because it's an isolated individual drum element, but it's played like it's live. And even listening to the record, I found myself for a second, I was like, wait, this is live drums, but it sounds like a drum machine. So there you go.
Yeah. And I think that's that's funny that you mentioned it, because I think that's part of a trick that I find I'm playing a lot these days, where, the popular climate is not really for rock music. And it's a pop world right now. Everybody is used to listening to heavily programmed, processed records. And when you make rock records, they don't feel like they quite fit in the world right now. They feel like they're almost from another time. So it's sort of like, how do you make something that is honest to the band, but at the same time make it fit into the popular culture? So I find that I'm often mutating drums to make them sound like programmed drums, and I'm often trying to torture guitars to make them sound like synthesizers. And it's kind of funny, but it's a great challenge. And I think you come up with sounds that are very ambiguous, and it makes the listener kind of go off on a bit more of an adventure with the sound.
Yeah. So you had sent me a thought before this, talking about how, quote, rock has become a 4-letter word, and, a producer needs to defy categorization. And it's interesting to hear you talk about that because, I work at the Bonnaroo Festival here and have run a studio there for 12 years outside of Nashville. And we lost one of our live band stages this last year. It got converted into a DJ and a singer with a mic. And so there is that kind of shift going on. But I'm a big fan of live, real bands playing together, and it's cool to hear you describe that. Also, guitar players, they really show up now with pedals that transform guitars into things that could be a synthesizer, and you don't know what they are sometimes.
Yes, absolutely. No, I think that part of it's actually a lot of fun, and it really becomes like there isn't a proper way to record a band anymore. There isn't. It used to be that if you didn't get the Marshall guitar tone captured properly, that it sounded honest to that guitar player, that people were very unhappy. Now it's a thing of like, well, how can we make this guitar sound like no guitar we've ever heard, as opposed to some stereotypical sound.
That's fun. All right, let's see. So speaking of guitars, also on the Strokes record, I'm looking for where I wrote this down. There it is. So I noticed that you had a great way of sort of making the guitars sound wider in the mix, especially when the chorus hit. Are there some mixing, tips or any advice you want to share with us about how to kind of widen guitars? One thing that I first experienced in the studio with electric guitars and then trying to process them is I processed them and I really made them sound like shit. So, like chorusy and harsh to the ear. What are some things that we can try out as far as widening guitars where we won't really screw it up?
Well, I think the first thing is that it comes in the recording, in the sense that if you're doubling guitars to make something wide, I always make sure that the double is somewhat different than the original, meaning like I change guitars, I change pickups, I change the balance of the microphones on the amp. I do something to slightly offset it, so there's a kind of wider phase, if you will, between the original and the double. So I kind of look in tracking to get as much width as possible. And then in terms of the mixing, now in the box, there's so many great MS plugins. The BX1 comes to mind right away, and even things like the Waves space or shifter plugin that moves frequencies around. Those I tend to use those kind of things a lot for guitars in mixing to get a little bit more sides happening in the mix.
Cool. And then one of the other records you did, the Jason Mraz, Love is a Four-Letter Word. Again, the acoustic guitar was sort of really nice stereo quality to it, and it left all this space in the middle for the vocal to be there, and then the bass and drums kicked in with it. How do you get an acoustic stereo sound? I live in Nashville, Tennessee. There are many chances to record just an acoustic and a vocal, and so often it's sort of mono with just some reverb that's stereo. What are some good ways to get a wider acoustic?
It depends on the song and all to me. Sometimes I'll do just a XY pair of KM84s or something like that. In the case of Jason Mraz, it was 2 microphones, one up by the neck and one down by the body, by the bridge. So it might have been a KM84 by the bridge that kind of picked up his fingers and his attack, and something up by the 12th fret that sort of picked up the body of the guitar, and that was the blend. It might have been a Telefunken 251 or a Sony C37A. I think we changed a lot depending on the song. Jason's a great player. He's got beautiful boutique guitars that sound wonderful. And then on top of it, Tony Maserati mixed that album and killed it, just killed it. He's just an extraordinary mixer, and there's something about his chain that is just so fat sounding that
he only mixes with his Waves plugins, right?
Yeah, I'm sure that's all. It's just the plugins.
I've got those. They're really fun, though.
No, they are. But it's Tony's ear. He's just like the ultimate of good taste. He's pretty incredible.
What about recording acoustic guitar and vocal? Is that something like with Jason? Would you have recorded the acoustic guitar and the vocal together? Is there a process for putting that all down onto tape that is a smart way to do it?
Sometimes it was actually live vocal and guitar. I go to a lot of extremes, and I built this crazy table, if you will, to put Jason's guitar in. It's hard to describe, but basically I put a big piece of foam or a piece of fiberglass and laid it on top of 2 microphone stands that were horizontal above his guitar. So it's almost like he was sitting down and playing in a box.
Holy crap.
And then there was his vocal microphone above that. So it was a little awkward at times, but it really did buy a lot of isolation when I needed it. We didn't use it always, but on a few things we did use it, and it helps. If you're in that situation where you need to get isolation, usually I find that the best combination is if you have somebody that sings softly but plays at normal or loud volume. Obviously, if you have somebody that plays quietly and sings loud, you're in trouble.
Right.
But that's when you get lucky is depending on the dynamics of the singer.
And you find that out when you just start recording them, or you go into the room and listen to them play, and you can tell right away.
Correct. Yeah.
Now, you had also recorded Tori Amos. Were there any cool things you did with her as far as, did you record vocals and piano at the same time, or did you have to isolate?
Sometimes we did. Sometimes it would be, blanketing up the piano and doing tracks live. Some of the songs on that record are voice and piano live. The one interesting thing, talking about vocal mics earlier and finding different mics for each singer, the one microphone that just worked so well for her was this old MyLab VIP 50, which I believe was like a rectangular capsule MyLab mic made in Sweden or Denmark. I'm sorry, I can't remember. And it just sounded so great on her voice. It just had all this emotion and character that ended up being the vocal mic for the album. And it was something that we stumbled upon, with a voice like that. Normally you would think C12, C251, something like that would work great. But the studio happened to have one, and it was just like instant. Like the minute you put it up, you went, oh, that's perfect for her.
That's cool. I have had a lucky opportunity to record her at my Bonnaroo Hay Bale studio one year.
Nice.
And it was just such a trip to watch her. She performs in that studio space. There were no cameras going or anything like that, but she, really performs when she's singing the song. And at the end, she would take her hands and well, first off, she didn't shake my hand before because she said she had just powdered her hands before the performance. And then her hands come off the piano and she does this like graceful angel wing sort of gesture down to the side away from the piano. And I was like, wow, that's cool,
She's great. She's a wonderful, wonderful artist. And I love the fact that she's just had such a long career and fills this void. Like really no one sounds like Tori, It's great. I live for that. I live for artists that don't sound like anyone else. That to me is the most exciting thing when you come across somebody that just, I don't know. You can't even describe what they sound like. That's just amazing. Final name drop. I noticed you also had Tim Easton on your discography list, and he's a great guy. He lives right here in East Nashville. I've recorded with him and his band in the past. Oh, great. Give Tim my love. He's such a wonderful guy. We had a really good time making that record together. We worked with all the Wilco guys. The Wilco was basically the backup band for the sessions. And
that's great.
They were just fantastic. I mean, they're obviously such great players and such nice people, and they were really good at interpreting Tim's songs and making him feel comfortable in the studio. It was really his first solo album, and he was, a little uncomfortable and a little nervous about working with a producer. And thanks to those guys, they made the experience easy for all of us.
Yeah. That's great. So, you just made a comment about you love finding artists like that have this unique expression that really stands out from everything else. Do you feel like in the beginning of your path, you like it took a while before you really began to have the opportunities to work with artists like that? Or do you feel like right from the get-go, coming from Boston, going out to Los Angeles, you just always sought out musicians and artists like that?
Yeah, I think I recognized that in artists. I don't think I fully understood or embraced it or realized how important and powerful it was. When I moved to LA and all of a sudden I'm working in a pro studio that major albums are being done on a daily basis, you realize how much music there is and how those unique artists really stand out from the pack. And I think it makes you appreciate it even more. And I also think it makes you cultivate it in any artist that you work with. I think part of the job is bringing that out of artists and pushing them to be something unique.
That's great. That's really cool. So we've been on for quite a while. I think I need to wrap up so that you can get to your next session. Do you want to answer a couple of the jam session questions and we'll finish?
Sure.
That's all right? Okay, cool. So the jam session, when you started out in recording, Joe, what was holding you back?
Oh boy. Perhaps like what I talked about earlier, I was so hung up on doing things properly, and I was so hung up on technique, and whatever I had heard was the way to record a singer or a drum kit, and I thought there were rules to recording, and there aren't.
There are only rules to talking in the studio.
Yeah.
Do you have any best advice from anybody that you want to share with us?
Wow. Not from a particular artist that I've worked with or anything like that. I'm a big believer in listening to a lot of different music. I think sometimes, especially early on, I know I got caught up only wanting to know about the kind of music that I liked and wasn't that interested in hearing some, ethnic music or some bluegrass or whatever it is. And the thing I found is when I started soaking up all these other genres of music, I started to understand what makes them tick and what makes them different from another style of music, and what's the priority here, what's important to this style of music that isn't important to something else. And I think when you start sort of crossing genres and bringing other influences into the music you work on, I think you come up with something that's much more unique and fresh.
That's cool. Do you have a listening tradition? Well, not tradition, like a regime for yourself now where you take time out just to listen?
Yeah, occasionally if, Sunday off, I'll just, listen to whatever playlist comes up, or, we're fortunate out here in LA. We have KCRW radio, which definitely plays a lot of progressive sort of things. I find that my mornings, my car ride into the studio in the morning is usually caught up listening to demos or pre-production or new artist or whatever. So there's a lot of time that goes into that's sort of work listening, if you will. But yeah, I love working with bands, because bands inevitably will talk to you about their other friend's band and go, oh man, you should hear this and you should hear that. So I'm always turned on to things. I just heard a band called Empty Houses the other day from Philly, New Jersey area that was so cool, really kind of old school R&B in a way, but a very kind of modern take on it. Fantastic. Really loved it.
That's great. I think I've learned more about cool new music from other people that I know or that have worked with than any other place. How about another, you want to share one more recording tip, hack, or secret sauce, something our rock stars could use in the studio today?
Okay. Let me see. Specific about anything, or?
Let's see. We did talk about drums. How about bass? We never talked much about bass.
Okay. I find bass, more than any other instrument, is in the hands of the player. A great player is going to give you a great bass sound. It's in the fingers. I started as a bass player. I had terrible tone, could never figure out why, until somebody else picked up my bass and started playing it, and instantly my instrument sounded way better. I kind of was like, oh, I get it now. So it's for starts, having a great player, having a great instrument. The other thing I find with recording bass, it's crazy how you have to make a bass amp in a rock setting crazy bright to cut through guitars. Like, you can never get it bright enough. It's just, no matter what you do, you just need more mids. I tend to often put a microphone, 3-5 feet off the amp that captures all that growl. I might do a close mic as well, but I think getting that distance and getting that character in the sound is really crucial.
Would you be using a direct sound as well?
Yeah, I always kind of use the direct. It's rare. Maybe the Raconteurs at times we didn't use a direct, but for the most part, I'm always using a direct just to get that middly honk and clarity to pop out of the track, get the bass forward sounding.
And do you recommend that people sort of time shift those to be in sync again, or do you just sort of move the mic on the amp back and forth a little bit and check polarity and just go with what you got?
Constantly checking phase, constantly running back and forth, moving a mic a half an inch. Every once in a while, I'll find that I've got to take the amp and nudge it a little bit. But I try not to do that. I try to get it at the source. But there are times that, for whatever reason, the room or the cab or, the other tricky thing is I've found that, like, when certain guitar pedals will flip the phase. So you might have your bass all set up fine, and then somebody patches a pedal in and you're like, wait a minute, what happened to my bass sound? And all of a sudden the phase into the amp got flipped. So I'm always with drum mics and guitar mics. I'm always flipping phase. I listen in mono an awful lot when I'm mixing and when I'm tracking to find out how things add up properly.
Nice. And are you listening in mono on the big speakers? And do you ever mute one of the speakers so that it's mono, but just a single speaker?
No, usually just mono in the middle.
Okay, cool. Good. I like it. That's easier.
Yeah.
How about something cool, a hardware or physical tool that you like to have in the session, or maybe something recent that you've really been digging?
Let's see. What have I been doing lately that I love? I'm as everybody is these days, hooked on distortion. So I'm using a lot of overstayer, saturator on a lot of things. That's all over the Morrissey record, all over the Broken Social Scene record that I did.
Terzo?
Jeff Terzo is making really great products. They're really useful. They're clever. They don't sound like other devices, and they're not crazy expensive either. So I'm using a lot of his stuff. Some of the Cush audio things. The Tweaker is an amazing compressor. I use the Clariphonic EQ on my mixes from time to time. And Chandler stuff. I love anything Wade builds. The Curve Bender has been on every mix I've done for the last 10 years. It's just an amazing sounding EQ. Boy, I don't know what else can I tell you hardware wise. I've heard some new mics from Audio Technica that I think sound great. They're very open and transparent.
Ken described you as being, not afraid to use an Audio Technica 4060. When those first came out.
I've used those on vocals all the time. They're really good sounding mics, and even the 4050s can be great on acoustic guitar. It took Audio Technica like 10 years or more to really get into the professional community, but to me, they're every bit as relevant and important as a AKG or Neumann or whatever you consider a standard.
Yeah, I have the 4033 here and use it all the time.
It's great.
So let's see. How about a software tool? Anything cool? Recent? Anything you saw at AES maybe you were excited about?
I want to get into the new Revoice Pro because often I'm doing tracks with a lot of background vocals that need to be aligned. That looks interesting. I'm pretty hooked these days on Eventide's Fission plugin. It's a plugin that lets you separate transient information from sort of steady state tonal information. That's pretty unique. I love the Isotope vocal synth. I use that all the time for, coming up with harmonies for instruments or really torturing them. Altar Boy is a great Sound Toys plugin that turns guitars into keyboards very easily. Yeah. That's great. Oh boy.
You don't have to go through the list of every plugin there is, but it's great to hear about these. How about a resource for the, well, I didn't mean to cut you off too. If there's anything else you want to mention, feel free to jump back in. But how about a resource for the business side of this? Any tools that are useful or any advice you want to give to people for who may be on this journey and want to do it for more than just a hobby?
Wow. I'd say go to law school, become a lawyer.
You'll be able to afford all the gear.
That's right. It's true. No, I think that it's the same thing. It's a part of this business that people do need to understand and learn. And a lot of times I know the creative community wants to shy away from the business side of things, but I think it's important that you understand how things work, especially now because business is changing so much, and there's with streaming, it's the world is opening up, and the way we distribute music, the way we get paid for music is changing rapidly. So I think that understanding the business side of it is something that people should not shy away from.
Yeah, well, you started out with somebody who believed strongly in understanding the business side, and that was Frank Zappa.
That's right. I mean, Frank was the first DIY independent artist that there was. I mean, He basically went to Warner Brothers and said, I don't like how you're treating me. I don't like doing business here. And I want to just kind of take my masters and put them out, license them, or put them out myself.
Yeah, and he did that for a long time.
Yep.
Okay, how about anything organizational? How do you keep your shit together?
Well, that's a good question.
Or do you? I think you do, though, right?
No, one thing I want to say, I almost mentioned it earlier. I think file organization is so important now, and I know for me personally, it's very important because my tracks are constantly flying around the planet. One day they're going off to a string arranger, for instance, with Morrissey. While I was in France working on his record, I had an arranger adding strings here in Los Angeles. So tracks went to LA and came back. Like I was telling you earlier, I'm just sending a track off to Michael Brower to be mixed. Nice. So labeling tracks properly and delivering Pro Tools sessions that are really easily understood, that is so crucial to me. I think you always have to think about file management like you are not the last person to see this file, that there is always somebody beyond you that is going to get this session, and you have to make it as clear and self-explanatory as possible.
Is there any sort of standard for that, or is there any way that you do it that you would like to share with us or let people know about? I mean, I could put a link to that in the show notes or something. Or is there an AES standard that we all follow or should be?
Actually, NARAS, the Grammy people, have come up with a white paper that I think they're distributing soon that really talks about how to deliver files to a record label. But, I think one thing that's important with labeling tracks and all is not labeling things in a personal way, labeling the tracks in a way that describes the function and the instrument. It's not important that a microphone name be there, but it's more important that it says high harmony vocal in third chorus as opposed to Bob C12.
Right.
That doesn't do a mixer any good. He wants to look at it and go, okay, these are the three harmony vocals that appear in the bridge, and doesn't have to waste any time discovering things. That's the most frustrating thing when you got a track to mix and you have to spend 2 hours sifting through the track trying to understand what's there, what's to be used, what's not to be used. I think you want to make the session as it's a book. You open it up and you read it.
Yeah, it makes Bob feel great to see his name on the track, but it makes the mixer feel terrible.
That's right.
Last two questions. These are both hypothetical. If you had to start all over again, Joe, and you're moving to a strange city, you needed to put together a simple setup to record, you wanted to find people to record, and you wanted to make a decision about making ends meet so you could survive as you started your recording path. What do you think you would do, or what advice would you give to somebody who's in that boat now?
Buy a laptop, an Apollo, a lot of UA plugins. I'd set up in my bedroom. I'd go to clubs at night, meet every musician I could, and invite them over to my house to record, and make as many friends as possible.
And then is it okay to take on a job that's, delivering pizzas or driving Uber while you're doing all this stuff? Or is it important that your first job be around music somehow?
No, I mean, you have to do what you have to do. I worked at a Dairy Queen.
Oh, that's great.
I sold hi-fi equipment. We all do what we have to do to get by. Man,
I want a poster in the studio of you just standing there smiling, holding like a soft serve ice cream.
Yeah, you'll never find it. Thank God.
That'd be inspiration right there. You can start anywhere. You'll be okay. Okay, so now let's take the Wayback Studio machine. You're going to go back in time. Maybe you're going all the way back to Boston, find young Joe, and you tap yourself on the shoulder, turn around. What are you doing here? Well, I come to give you this one bit of advice. Here's the single most important thing you need to know to be a recording studio rock star yourself one day. What advice would you give yourself if you could go back in time like that?
Wow. I think I would have just jumped into the game earlier. I think that I was afraid to break away from my community of musicians and friends, and I took a little longer kind of hanging out, and wish I'd sort of dove into the major leagues a little sooner for me personally. So I might say that if you're really passionate about doing this and you believe this is what you want to do, I would just say don't hesitate.
That's wonderful. Joe, thank you so much for being on Recording Studio Rockstars with us. Thank you for going extra time too. We appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Very,
it was a pleasure.
much.
A lot of fun.
How can the Rockstars find you online? How can they find out more about you and your music?
They can Google me, and my manager's email will come up, and they can always get to me through Adam Katz at Next Wave Management. Okay,
wonderful. Joe, thanks again. I look forward to meeting you in person and seeing you in the studio. Rockstars, we will include links to all this wonderful stuff Joe's talked about with us in the show notes. Just go to rsrockstars.com and then search Joe. You're going to find it right away. It will also be in your mobile app in the show notes. You can just click through and get it there. Thanks again, Joe.
My pleasure. It was a lot of fun.
It was great to meet you, man. Thank you. Cheers.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help reach more people. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And if you want more free content, all you have to do is text RS Rockstars to 33444. Again, that's RS Rockstars to 33444, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, and podcast updates. And I'll let you know about any upcoming giveaway offers, all totally free. Thanks for listening. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.